Hi, this is David Gornoski, host of A Neighbor's Choice and Things Hidden podcast, as well as some of our other programs like Science and You with our Chief Science Advisor, Dr. Yu, and our Seed Oil Survival series that we continue to have great fun unpacking the truth of nutrition. I wanted to give you a quick little message saying we appreciate all the support that we get from our monthly contributors and our one-time donation supporters. And we'd encourage all of you to go to our website, aneighborschoice.com, click on contribute, and make a monthly pledge today, whether it's $1, $5, 15, 20, 50, whatever you want to do. Doesn't matter. Just be a part of building this new media project that we've developed to empower and inform, to inspire, to kickstart a scientific renaissance, an anthropological breakthrough and reformation in the church. All these things are possible with your support right now. So make that commitment today and help us keep doing the productions that we have. Thank you.
Well, today we're back for another issue, another episode, another topic of great interest to our audience here on the Seed Oil Survival podcast. And that is, we're going to explore the lifestyle of individuals who are turning to the principles of Ray Peat to find a whole flourishing way of living. And it's almost a whole philosophy that Ray Peat, the great late Ray Peat, who we've had on the program many times before his passing recently. And I got to know him offline. He's a great guy. And we miss him and his insights, but many great people are carrying on his work and principles and applying it to the broader public. And that's who we have today, Dalton, with Analyze and Optimize. How you doing, sir?
Hey, thanks for having me on. I've actually been a pretty big fan of A Neighbor's Choice for a while now. Probably a couple of years. I've watched a ton of your interviews with Tucker and with Brad, and of course with Ray when you had the opportunity to speak to him. So yeah, it's pretty awesome. So thanks for having me.
Well, thank you. You guys are tearing it up on Twitter and really introducing people to the principles, doing a great job with that. I'm a little newer to Twitter, so I'm still trying to get kind of a hang of the whole format, and optimize it. But that's what you guys are doing. Great work with your threads. How long have you been doing Ray Peat style, like eating and dieting and principles?
I would say it's right around like 2.5 years at this point. Yeah. So before then we were, we did the whole roller coaster that everyone goes through, from eating the normal diet and then, maybe trying to count calories, and then you go to keto and then to carnivore, and then you're fasting, and then everyone seems to end up in bioenergetics.
Yeah.
At least that's a common trend that I see. So yeah, that was pretty much our exact trajectory as well. So I would say like end of 2020, early 21, I really started to get into this kind of stuff. And it actually, with everything that was happening with the virus and the so-called pandemic and the lockdowns and whatnot, it was like probably the best time to get into his kind of ideas, because it actually ended up explaining a lot, not just like politically, culturally, like what was going on, but also biologically, which I thought was just endlessly fascinating.
Right. Yeah, it's a game changer for sure. And I kind of was in the keto and carnivore world for years, and we're introducing a lot of the carnivore guys to my broadcast radio audience. And then I started seeing a friend of mine who was telling me about, well, there's this Ray Peat guy, you need to read him. And I kept looking at him and kept circling around, and eventually I started trying to adapt to some of his principles. But it is a tricky thing. I saw the Bronze Age pervert guy recently said, oh, Ray Peat, he's mentally ill, or whatever. I don't know. He's not German, whatever his accent is. I don't know. I have it, but he's mentally ill. All of his fans are getting diabetes because they're eating tons of sugar and taking their temperature all the time, like neurotic freaks. Which, I've heard that's not the only guy that said something like that. So we don't want to create another personality cult or another. Dear God, we got plenty of that. It's the whole world is made up of that. But what has been the most concrete value to your life that learning from the late biologist Ray Peat has done for you?
Well, actually, I hadn't heard that. That's pretty funny. But
Well, he got,
um,
he kind of popularized what he did was his book apparently kind of popularized because I had been familiar with Ray Peat for a while. Then I heard people talking about Bronze Age pervert and how he was introducing the idea of the importance of the endocrine system and hormones, and the importance of keeping those in balance with vitality, the Nietzschean philosophy that he's into. And so he had kind of popularized Ray Peat to a lot of people that followed his work. And then he kind of disavowed, like, well, don't follow everything about Ray Peat, and we don't want to,
yeah,
I don't want to get into that where it's like, you got to follow what does the guru say, but just from a concrete standpoint, what has been the best value? Like, did you have a health problem, or maybe a family member had a problem that you were, besides the pandemic, that spurred you to apply some of his insights, and what was the best value you got out of it so far?
yeah, absolutely. So I hadn't heard anything about Bronze Age pervert talk. I mean, I know he's like a huge kind of figure in this space, but I personally am not really familiar with any of his work. I mean, any of his work, so I don't want to necessarily speak on that.
Right.
What I will say is that it's very interesting to see a lot of people say like, "Oh, everyone that like follows the Ray Peat diet, or like every like Peter or so on and so forth, everyone that does this diet, like has X outcome, or is fat, or is diabetic, or is insane apparently. I think it's very funny because it's pretty obvious like who just like sees people trying to get into Pete and sees people on Twitter or maybe on the forum and whatnot who are trying to incorporate his principles versus like what the man actually said.
Right.
And now unfortunately, he's no longer with us to sort of defend himself and say like, oh, I didn't say that, or that's not what I meant, or anything like
Yeah.
that. But the biggest aspect of Peating, if you will, or Ray Peat's work, obviously you have the whole paradigm of energy and structure, but probably his most iconic line ever is authoritarians like to talk about protocols, but the only valid protocol would be something like perceive, think, act. And that is really the most important part of everything, is that, it's not about eating this many grams of whatever sugar and then this many grams of fat and this percentage has to be saturated and so on and down the line. It's not really about that. It's more about the principles that he, sort of wrote about and talked about and stood for. Um, and it just becomes hard to like, if you want to argue about the biology of it, that's one thing. But I think it becomes very difficult to argue that his principles in and of themselves are flawed, because he's really just talking about listening to your body, increasing your body's capability to have energy, the metabolic rate, and then lowering stress. So if you're going to attack Ray Peat at large, you're kind of arguing against those principles. And I'm not saying that there aren't people that do that. There are plenty of people who think that lowering the metabolism is good, or that having more stress is good, or even not listening to your body and kind of just going off of discipline and things. But I think that those are the more important arguments, rather than any one specific thing, because the truth be told, no two people that are into Ray's work and into this sort of bioenergetic paradigm pull it off in the same way. The diets vary a lot, the supplementation varies a lot, the lifestyles vary a lot, and that's kind of the cool thing in the community, is that there's a lot of healthy argument, I would say, because we all agree on like the fundamental principles. And then from there, you're just trying to figure out the best way to go about it. And that, again, is on an individual basis. So with that all being said, my personal experience, I guess, I grew up, I was always an athlete. I was always into lifting weights and diet and whatnot, in the if it fits your macros kind of stuff growing up. And then I went to college, gained a bunch of weight because I kind of stopped caring about all that stuff. And then by the end of my freshman year in college, so it was like 2018, I was like 230 pounds. And I'm like 5'9" on a good day. So I was I was really big. I still had like some muscle, but it was not good. And my health was, just garbage. I had like GERD, and I had you know, being overweight. I had like almost like respiratory problems. I had sleeping problems. I had zero energy, like brain fog, all this stuff. And then I really started to get into keto and fasting, and that was like a lifesaver for that year period, like 2018 to 19. And then in August of 2019, basically everything shit kind of hit the fan all at once, and not all at once. The writing was sort of on the wall. I can look back and say that, but I basically completely crashed, and my main problem was that I developed like absolutely debilitating like GI issues, and that really coincided with a lot of like brain fog and just irritability and sort of anhedonia about life, just like helplessness, all that kind of stuff, all these different mood effects. But the primary thing in my mind was the gut. And it was weird to me because I'd seen so many people with the keto and the fasting and the carnivore, heal so many gut problems. And then there I was like developing one of my own. And in my head, I was like, well, where am I supposed to go now? Like, I'm obviously like not going to go back to eating like the standard diet. You couldn't pay me enough to do like a vegan diet or whatever. And then of course, you go to all the GI docs, and they, God bless them, but they're just not put in a position to succeed. And they don't really have any answers for these type of things unless you literally go get a colonoscopy and have like colon cancer. Then if you just have, nondescript sort of gut problems, they're kind of at a loss for words. So then you're pretty much on your own. So yeah, but keto, carnivore, fasting, that kind of stuff is very tribal. So I try to, even with the peak kind of stuff now, I try to like stay away from it getting too tribal, because then you really start to run into problems when you think you have everything figured out.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, so it's very tribal. So even though I clearly had developed this problem as a result of the chronic fasting and carnivore and stuff, I continued on the diet for another, I would say, year and a half. And then probably in like December of 2020, I first got introduced to Danny Roddy. And I know you've had Georgie on before, right? So
Yeah.
I first started watching Generative Energy with those guys a little bit. And, obviously at first I'm like, these guys are insane. How can you say that sugar is good? They're saying that caffeine is good. That's insane. And, slowly but surely, just the way that they talked, not being super like trying to shove things down your throat, and just the way that they explained things, it seemed like much more holistic, and it seemed much more like it seemed to be able to explain things that I observed in my own life and then in the world around me a lot more.
Mm-hmm.
So slowly but surely, I kind of transitioned to, I was doing my carnivore, but then I would have like a little bit of honey or like a little bit of potatoes, and then it became a lot of honey. And then, by, I would say mid 2021, I was just, eating white sugar and having fruit juice and all that good stuff. So yeah, so I kind of started from there. My like, I don't want to say like saving grace, because there's no silver bullets, but the thing that had the biggest impact for me was actually using antibiotics. And this is actually something that I deal with a lot, because I do my own personal consultations on Patreon now. And we're in the midst of launching another consultation service. But this story is actually so common that I see when people are doing the chronic dieting, specifically the low carb and the fasting stuff, and they actually end up with these bad gut problems that are bacterial driven in nature. And oftentimes taking the prescription antibiotics can be like an absolute lifesaver or a life changer in a lot of circumstances. So, that was probably
you think it's because of the slow gut motility and meat staying in the colon too long and going through the digestive tract? Is that what's going on there?
I don't think so. I think more than anything, it's just the chronic stress and the
chronic stress of gluconeogenesis that the body's doing to get sugar from the protein that you're eating. Is that what you're suggesting, or something else? And
Yeah,
could you
yeah,
mention keto and carnivore people having gut issues? So
yeah,
yeah,
yeah. Of course, not like uniformly, but it depends. What I think happens is that, if you're restricting the carbohydrates, pretty much all of your stress hormones begin to rise, because that is the primary signal of stress. All of your stress hormones basically work to create more sugar and to liberate more fat from the stored tissues. That's the quintessential stress response. And with that, you do have you can get slowed motility, but you also just get general suppression of the immune system, and that's like very important for the integrity of the GI tract. And I think that's what allows for a lot of these sort of like chronic low grade infections to start. And then the other thing is that, a lot of times people may have already been dealing with some level of gut issues their whole lives before they even got on these diets. And then they get on the diet, they cut out 90% of the garbage that people eat out there that's already irritating the gut. And they're like, oh my God, I feel so much better. And then, it ends up biting them because it's not a great long-term solution, I don't think.
sure.
So like, in my case, like I can look back and say, I had gut problems for as long as I can remember. I remember going to my best friend's house pretty much like every day, and we were eating gushers and fruit roll-ups. It's all that kind of stuff, and eating like Pizza Hut and all this stuff just growing up. And I remember, throughout my life, even if it wasn't as obvious as it was then, like things were never functioning as optimally as they should have been. And then, it's like you go on to these like elimination sort of diets and things can get better, but you can't just live constantly eliminating things. And if you feel the need to constantly eliminate things, it's a sign that, things are not heading in the right direction, because ideally health is about, abundance. It's about doing more, being able to do
yeah.
more, not, boxing yourself into this sort of paradigm. But to
I
answer your
I
question,
remember.
yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
I remember Ray Peat told me he used to eat like 5,000 calories a day. And I think that's one of the things that people run into mistakes when they try to integrate some of his principles, right? Is they've been having, a high stress diet for whatever reason, whether it's the standard American diet or low carb or vegetarian or whatever, low calorie, and they've been doing that for years, and then they're like, oh, so high calorie, so they just switch over overnight to eating a high calorie version of Ray Peat's philosophy, and it's not, your body's not going to be ready for that, right? It's like you're pouring too much fuel, it's not able to process it, right? And so I think that's one of the common mistakes, is they're like, oh, ice cream and all these things, and it's like, no, that's unfortunately, you usually, depending on your issue or your age and or your particular situation, you can't just jump into 5,000 calories a day when you've been eating the way most people have in this stressful diet system, right?
Yeah, absolutely. The metabolic rate can absolutely be suppressed through, chronic carbohydrate restriction and chronic stress and things of that nature. And it's very common for people, and I'm included in this boat, but it's very common for, if you've been constantly restricting yourself, your metabolic rate is essentially adjusted to, eating a certain amount of calories, and then you're maintaining
Yeah.
at that low level, and you don't feel very good because your metabolism is so low. And then, incorporating more sugars and more calories and things, yeah, your body essentially knows that it is in a conservation sort of state. And I actually just did a whole video about this in terms of weight loss and stuff. But yeah, I mean, your body is in a endocrine and biochemical state that is promoting the storage of fat, and it's suppressing the metabolic rate, because that's the signal that you've been, giving to it for possibly your whole life. So yeah, it is sort of a bit naive to think that you could just overnight, start pouring in tons and tons of calories and for everything to just go over smoothly. And, it is, it can be discouraging for people to hear that. But
Yeah.
what you're really trying to do is you're trying to get to a good state of health holistically. And that includes increasing the metabolic rate and decreasing stress over time. And then, once you reach that sort of equilibrium, you should be able to eat more and you should be able to eat intuitively and you should be fine. But it can take a lot of time and a lot of different interventions to get there. Um, it's not, unfortunately, it's not as simple as just adding in certain foods and then metabolic rate immediately goes up. If you've been stuck in that state for a while, there are a number of different culprits that you need to address before you can reasonably expect to have better body composition.
So the reason why low carb and keto tends to be kind of effective is that you've got people basically leaning into the state that people are in, right? Where they're burning fat for fuel. It kind of leans into it and optimizes that method and cuts out some of the seed oils and, some of the inflammatory grains. Well, you're cutting a lot of inflammatory grains if you're doing keto. And so there's a lot of overlap let me just put this out. There's a lot of overlap about the principles you learn from keto and Ray Peat, right? I mean, like Ray Peat's not very pro grains, I mean, especially the way, like wheat is and these types of modified grains that we have in America. He's not very pro grain on that level. And, even he talks about the obesogenic effects of starches, which is interesting. I talked to Brad Marshall a lot, who's still, he does all kinds of experimentation with weight loss because he wants to find out what's really causing it. And he's, experimenting with starches. And I go back and forth with him about, well, how do we know, because, Ray Peat's saying starches are obesogenic compared to, sugar. But, some of the principles that you learn, like Ray Peat agrees with the carnivore community about a lot of the plant phytochemicals and stressors that a lot of vegetables have, right? And so, of course, another overlap is the seed oil thing and reducing PUFA that a lot of the keto and carnivore community understands. So it's kind of a journey. You kind of go through that keto carnivore world and you pick up principles that you keep with you when you adjust to trying to maybe introduce carbohydrates. I think there's so many ways to take this, and you can jump in if you need to about some of those things I just said. But in general, I think that it's a practically smart thing to do when we live in this world where they're trying to like cull all of these beef cattle and everything and eliminate animal products, and food inflation continues to go up. I think it's actually a practical and pragmatic consideration to say, what, maybe the debate on the keto carnivore versus Ray Peat world is not fully settled, but from a pragmatic standpoint, it will cost my pocketbook less money if I'm drinking orange juice and milk as my primary foundation rather than ribeyes. You know what I mean? From a cost standpoint
Yeah,
and from an access market standpoint, just that alone
absolutely.
might make people consider that.
Yeah, and I mean that's something that Ray would talk about very often is that, a lot of the reason why many of these interventions that he would write about are not talked about is, if it's in the case of a supplement or a drug, it would be that, it's old, so it can't be patented, and thus you can't really make money off of it. If you're talking about nutrients, it's hard to, patent something that's endogenously occurring or that,
Right.
you get through food. And then, like you said, with the diet, the milk, orange juice, those are things that people, because of Ray's kind of views on the world and on politics, like one of his primary goals was to help the lower class, have more energy so that they could sort of stand up to this tyranny that they were under. So
He
yeah,
was thinking of also the economic value of promoting milk and orange juice. That's interesting. I talked to him.
absolutely.
I did one interview with him about his politics, and that was fun. But I didn't get into that part. That's cool.
Yeah. I think that was a primary focus, and it, it matters in the context of like, he was trying to figure out what would be good for the lower class to to eat for that. But it also matters because it ties into the narratives that we are sort of told about different things. You know, like I was saying before with the drugs and the supplements, if these, you know, corporations can't exactly make money off of it, or on the flip side, if they can and they have some sort of agenda to fulfill, you know, we just did a whole documentary about birth control. It's a great example. Like that, for example, you have bioidentical progesterone, which, you know, Ray would talk about very often, potent anti-stress, like declines in aging, super productive for a lot of different things. And then you had a bunch of pharmaceutical companies come in and say, oh, well, we can't use that. And they made up, you know, whatever reason, it's not orally bioavailable or whatever the case may be. And then they come up with a synthetic analog that they can use to patent, sell for more money, have the exclusive rights to. And then that also, you know, serves a different agenda. You know, in that case, it was, you know, certain, whether it's feminist agendas or if it's, you know, depopulation, honestly, that is a factor as well. So it's actually, I think it's really interesting how the biology sort of intersects with all of those historical and sort of political events. And, you know, it's something that
you're talking about, when you talk about synthetic, you're talking about estrogen, right?
Well, estrogen is a huge one, yeah. But the most of the hormonal birth controls out there, what actually inhibits the pregnancy process is something called a synthetic progestin. So it's basically,
okay.
Yeah, I don't know if you heard of it much, but it's essentially like like they say it's the same thing as progesterone. Of course, it's not. It's pharma's way of synthesizing a new progesterone analog that has specific effects. In this case, it's birth control. Of course, the estrogens, that's a whole other can of worms, and those are in birth control as well, but they're pretty much everywhere else in the environment. And that's not a coincidence. If you consider, you know, what we've been told about estrogen being the female hormone and all those types of things.
Yeah. And I mean, they've completely ideologically oriented our world around like trying to accommodate for, you know, too much estrogen that's not healthy for the woman or the man. And they've tried to gaslight the public into basically accommodating a worldview, which is a response to a very stressful, unnatural amount of this chemical in the body, right? And trying to basically ideologically brainwash us into believing that this is the new way of how humans should feel. It's pretty insane when you think about it that way, you know?
Yeah, and I mean the seed oil thing is a great example of that because you know, it's not even really controversial in the literature that the saturated fats are like more pro-androgenic, so that they like result in higher testosterone levels, whereas the polyunsaturated fats have more estrogenic type of effects. And you know, that's just one obvious example, but everything that Ray seemed to talk about was pushing you more towards the androgenic or thyroid driven anti-stress sort of state, whereas everything in our environment is pushing you towards the pro-estrogenic stress, lower metabolism state. And you know, it's the case so often that it's just, it becomes very difficult to argue that it's all by coincidence. I'll just say that.
Yeah. What is when you remove the incarnational truth of reality that you know, the intelligence behind the universe is incarnated and cares about the human person, when that worldview is dethroned for an anti-human worldview and an anti-body worldview, you're going to get a lot of repercussions for people that are very disastrous to live through. But that's why we're doing this, because we're gonna do our best to make a path for people out of this nonsense. But I want to go back to the issue of you know, trying to adapt to the Ray Peat way of doing and people having problems with it. A lot of people are going to approach this from a need to have weight loss. Now, one thing I've heard from Ray Peat that may be confusing for some, so I'll throw this to you, is that he'll often say, well, if you're significantly overweight and you need to lose weight, you should restrict your calories. But then he says, well, don't do a low calorie restricted diet. So how does that fit into the whole vision of what he has in mind there for folks who might be confused? For example, he'll say, cut down your, I've heard him say on several interviews, stop eating, if you're overweight, stop eating. But then he says later on, he'll say in other times, if you're doing a fasting or low calorie restriction, that's going to be stressful and estrogenic and all these other things. So where's the line in the Ray Peat worldview from what you understand between you need to lose a lot of weight, and he's telling people who are in that situation, stop eating. So he's kind of saying a low calorie thing, but then not too long. So where's the sweet spot there?
I'm honestly not too sure. I'm not sure. I mean, he might have just been saying that tongue in cheek, kind of, but at the same time, he's pretty calculated with what he says. So honestly, I don't know about that one. I would say that.
Well, obviously, you can't jump into eating 5,000 calories a day, right?
Yeah,
so we know that you're going to have somewhat of a caloric restriction, at least to adjust to the Ray Peat world if you're trying to introduce carbohydrates, right? You can't eat 3,000 calories of carbs if you've been doing low carb or low calorie in America, right? You're going to have to kind of go. So what's the general transition that you've seen with your observations?
So I think it's important to look in the long term, because like I said before, it's very common for if someone has been undergoing a lot of stress and has kind of been dealing with poor metabolism for quite some time, they might just be craving massive amounts of sugar. And to be honest, I don't think that that's something that you want to ignore, sort of under the guise of perceive, think, act, and listening to your body. I think that there's a very real reason why people crave so much food and so much sugar when they first get on it. And yeah, it is natural to start to gain some weight in the process, but that doesn't mean that you're metabolically moving in the wrong direction, because I think that there are a lot of cases where, if people have been on extremely restrictive diets, restricting carbs, restricting calories, and doing a lot of strenuous exercise, that, they're essentially forcing their bodies into being lean. And then their metabolic rate is so suppressed and they're so stressed that they can actually see an improvement in their health if they put on some more weight. And that's especially true with the digestive problems, because if people have had gut issues for however long, and then their appetite is very suppressed because of that, starting to eat more and starting to become more in tune with your appetite, even if it leads to you gaining some weight in the short term, I still look at that as a net positive for your health. And, I think it's hard to separate out the issue of weight loss from all of the other health issues that the person might be going through, because what you're really trying to do is you're trying to sort of embark on a health journey that, when you are in your state of optimal health, that you do have a good body composition, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you won't gain a little bit of weight along the way. Now, I think if you are incorporating the sort of bioenergetic principles, I don't think that there is much of a risk of someone just overtly completely blowing up and becoming outright obese or anything like that. In most cases that I see, people will gain a fair bit of weight, but then as they continue to improve things over time and the metabolic rate adjusts, they can start to lose that. So, I think just trying to be more in tune with your cravings and what your body is sort of asking for, especially if you've been denying and ignoring that signal for so long, is extremely important. And one of the things that we also know from various sort of overfeeding and high carb feeding studies is that eating tons and tons of carbs is one of the best ways to raise your metabolic rate, as crazy as it sounds. Now, that doesn't mean that you won't end up storing some fat in the process. But what it does mean is that if you've been burning lots of fat because you've been stressed and because you've been restricting for so long, that reintroducing carbohydrates, sometimes in massive amounts, is a great way to sort of get the biological system primed for burning more carbohydrates, and that the burning of carbohydrates being this like quintessential sign of health, and that being sort of this positive feedback loop where if you're good at it, you're just going to be able to keep metabolizing them. And that's when you start to really recover and really achieve true health. I think that is something important. Sorry, God.
Do you think that it's possible to be metabolically healthy, to be switching to burn fat for fuel and carbs for fuel, and kind of switch in between every now and then? Or do you think you should always just be ideally burning carbohydrate for fuel?
No,
I know you're always burning a little bit of fat for fuel, even when you're in a highly carbohydrate optimized diet, right? But
absolutely,
some people suggest you need to be, cycling in as if the seasons, when it's winter, maybe let your body go through a little bit more ketogenic style fuel at some point, and then switch back into a high carb way of fueling your body when there's more abundant, carbohydrate foods in season of that year. What do you think of that?
I think that might be more relevant if we didn't live sort of in our modern environment, which already is trying so hard to push you into the stress state of fat burning. So you are correct when you say that you're always burning some fat. So your muscles and your heart and your liver consume good amounts of fat. That's kind of just their so-called preferred fuel, even at rest. So those organs are always going to be consuming some amount of fat, and then you have some fat utilization throughout the body always. I do still think that you want to be trying always to optimize your metabolism for carbohydrate oxidation, because that's really what's associated with the absolute best health. If you look at pretty much, and this is kind of where everything becomes unified with bioenergetics, but any disease that you can think of, it is always characterized by an impaired ability to burn carbohydrate. It's never the case that people have an impaired, lipolytic activity, which is the releasing of fat from the stores, or an impaired, ability to burn fat, at least relative to carbohydrate. All the chronic diseases that we see, all the metabolic diseases that we see, are really characterized by an inability to burn glucose properly. And to get back to the point about seasonality, I think that is important because, if you just do nothing, then you will inevitably become a fat burner. And I think in today's day and age where everything is pushing you in that direction, I don't see why you would want to intentionally add on top of that. And it might be the case where in nature, you will have periods of carbohydrate restriction, et cetera. But at the same time, I think that life just throws so many stressors at you in general that I don't think that trying to intentionally add to that is worth it. I think in pretty much in every case, that people would be better served trying to protect themselves against stress rather than look for ways to add stress in. Because, if you're living, a life that you, in the long run are going to consider to be fulfilling, you're already going to have tons of stressors thrown at you, whether you like it or not. I mean, unless you're, really just hanging out at home and not doing anything. If you're out, you're trying to achieve your goals, you're trying to meet people, you're trying to go places, you're trying to do different things, challenge yourself. Those things always are imposing stressors on you. And then that's outside of the environmental toxins that are also posing stress on you. So the way that I look at it is that, you should be trying to protect your body against that stress as much as possible, because you couldn't avoid it even if you really wanted to.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very well said. So Well, let's talk about a little bit of what you do in a day. What do you eat, and what supplements do you take? Are you taking? Let's just start with the food. Like, what would you estimate your daily caloric intake is? Not that you're counting, but what would you guesstimate maybe?
So I do count once in a blue moon just to kind of see what because people will inevitably ask me that. I hate counting calories. I don't know how anybody does it. I don't know how I used to do it. Because even doing it for a day is like such a pain in the ass to me. But basically my typical day is I wake up, try to wake up at like 5:30 or 6, depending on, you know, uh, the sunrise, because I think that getting morning sunlight is absolutely critical. But with that, I have my coffee in the morning with some milk and sugar.
What coffee do you have? Do you use uh, the instant coffee, or do you use French press, or what?
Oh, I have a pour over setup. I use
Okay,
espresso. So
so you do the hipster coffee, okay?
it's worth it.
You don't do
But
working
yeah,
man coffee. You don't do working man coffee like Ray Peat's Folgers instant coffee, right?
well, when I have to go to work, then sometimes I'm forced into that. But in the mornings, that's one of my pleasures is having the high quality stuff.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I have that with some milk
You
and
put honey in,
sugar.
you use milk and sugar. You don't use honey. Is there a reason why?
Honestly, I just think it tastes better with the raw cane sugar. The
Yeah.
honeys are for different sort of occasions for me. That's like if I'm really craving like a lot of sugar, then I'll put down some honey. But
Yeah.
just for the coffee, you know, I I'll just have whatever 30-ish grams of sugar in my coffee if I had to say, and then it's like half coffee, half milk, and then that will last me typically until lunch. I almost never eat actual breakfast. Um,
Now,
I guess that's just
isn't that kind of frowned upon in the Ray Peat community? You need to eat robust amounts of calories at breakfast and so forth, or no?
well, I think it would be frowned upon if I was having like black coffee.
Okay.
And I wasn't having like any calories because that
Oh, okay.
is that's a completely different ballgame. But yeah, I'm pretty much just always sipping the coffee with milk and sugar, maybe some orange juice in the morning, keep things pretty light. And then, when I'm actually like hungry for like solid food or protein, then at lunch, I really like lean red meats. So I really like venison, obviously like beef, and I like lamb a lot. I try to get like the more gelatinous cuts of that stuff. Or if not, then I'll just add straight gelatin to ground beef or ground venison or whatever the case may be. But I really like the collagenous cuts of that. So things like lamb leg
And
or shanks.
what are some collagenous versions of that for the general public?
Yeah, it's actually again comes back to the economic thing again, but it's kind of funny because the most like expensive cuts of meat or steak or whatever are actually the ones with the least amount of collagen. So again, it's kind of in your favor to get the more collagenous stuff anyway. But things like so I really like lamb leg, I like shanks, I really like chuck roast for beef.
Now, don't they have a lot of
And
fat on them? Do you trim the fat off, or do you eat the fat?
There's not a ton of fat. There's a decent amount of fat, and that's another topic we can sort of get into. But I also don't think that bioenergetics needs to be this like very low fat diet. I think that's something that a lot of people think that they have to do.
What
But
about if you're trying to lose weight? Would you still cut low fat, or you think you should do robust amounts of fat and carbs?
um, So what I say is, understand that carbohydrate, specifically sugar, is your primary fuel source. And then the fat can kind of just fill in, the fat and the protein kind of just fill in, as you kind of see fit. I think if you're craving tons and tons of fat, then, again, that's an important sign that you want to consider because dietary, especially saturated fat, does have a lot of like unique functions. So for example, it's very protective for the liver. It also allows you to secrete more bile. So if have slow motility or you have constipation or something, that can help get things moving. And as we talked about before, it has this sort of pro-androgenic effect. in addition to just having other anti-stress effects. But yeah, so I mean, again, I think it ultimately comes down to what you crave. I think, in my case, I'm typically, if I had to say, I'm probably around like 50 to 60% carbohydrate, pretty much all from sugar, and then 20 to 30% protein and fat, kind of filling it out.
And now,
But
when you say sugar, are you eating fruit sugars and cane sugar and honey, or are you including starches and grains?
most of the time it's just I have milk with, like, I just add in sugar, or I have honey or ice cream if I'm, if I'm like really craving it a lot. And then a lot of orange juice. Those would be my big ones. I have starches sometimes. Like, I like sourdough. It's a little bit more digestible. And then things like nixtamalized corn, so corn flour, so like masa. I can make like quesadillas with that. That's pretty cool. But
And
that is
when you cook these meats and these tortillas, are you cooking them in coconut oil, or are you using butter?
well, for the meats, I don't really, well, I guess for like a steak, if I'm gonna sear it, then yeah, I would, coconut oil is not quite as good for that. So I actually
Yeah.
will do like olive oil or butter or ghee for that. But yeah, so I actually kind of agree with Brad when he says that, monounsaturated fats are not quite as ideal as saturated
Right.
fats. That seems to be pretty well supported, and it is definitely the case that people who are overweight are already producing much more monounsaturated fat than otherwise healthy or lean person does. But again, I'm not like super afraid of monounsaturated fat, and yeah, I mean, I think in general, like, it's kind of like such a hard paradigm shift for people to say, like, okay, here are these like principles, but don't feel like you need to restrict this macronutrient, or don't feel like you need to eat this specific food if you don't like it. um so I guess that's why, like, I tell people like what I eat, but in terms of like what they should eat, I think it's a much bigger conversation than just like, oh well, like, here's your shopping list, like, go get it, and then here's like what your calories should look like.
Right.
It can be hard for a lot of people to sort of understand that, just because we've been given very strict guidance on what we should be eating, whether it's from the government or from just other people who are honestly trying to help.
Well,
But
humans are
just sort
just
of,
mimetic. Humans are mimetic. They don't really like to freestyle too much. They like to act like they freestyle, but they really want to kind of emulate. Everybody always wants to act like they're the originator of everything they've ever done, and try to. That's kind of the human problem. But yeah, I mean, people are going to try to emulate, really, if they see someone that they think is having success with something. So you eat is lunch your biggest meal of the day, or do you snack a lot, graze, for people who are interested in what you're using for success?
so I normally just have like the two solid meals. So any sort of calories that I have in between is mostly just either the coffee with the milk and the sugar in the morning, like, because I might just be having like a couple of those throughout the morning, and then by the time lunch hits, it's like, oh wow, I've had 70 or 80 or 100 grams of sugar and I didn't even realize it. But um other than that, I just like to sip the juices. So I really like lemonade, and I really like different types of fruit juices. Obviously orange juice is the big one, but yeah, I would say most of the time lunch is my biggest meal. And then it's not like super concrete, but I would say dinner most of the time has like a little bit more fat. So I'll probably have like eggs, or maybe I'll have like the fattier steak then. And then, in the afternoon, I will have something like shellfish or scallops. Sorry, shrimp, shellfish, like shrimp or scallops. I like oysters a lot. Things like that.
Why do
And
you? What's the benefit of eating shellfish in the evening? Is there a reason, or it's just the way you like it?
oh no, there's I don't think there's anything behind the timing. It's just kind of, I think
Yeah.
I think for me, I prefer to have things like leaner during the lunch meal. And then I find that if I have like too low fat of a meal at night, then my sleep won't be quite as good. And again, I think that has to do with the sort of like additional anti-stress effect that the extra fat has. So that, and then it also tends to sort of delay your absorption of the carbohydrates. So it'll kind of allow you to last longer throughout the night. A lot of people find that when they restrict fat too much, they just have like a ravenous sort of hunger. And I completely understand that. And that's one of the reasons why I'm not a big fan of just telling people to always restrict it, because, I think it clearly has a lot of value. I just don't think that your diet should be based on burning fat and eating fat to burn it. But it absolutely plays a huge role.
What about like, is there a timing where people should not eat past a certain time before bed or whatever, or you don't get into that?
No, I don't necessarily think so. I think what's more important is trying to keep your eating time and your waking time consistent. So I was talking a little bit about this before, but yeah, I think like in terms of, just optimizing your circadian rhythm, kind of making sure that your body knows what time of day it is. So, for me, I've been sort of in that routine of waking up at sunrise, having the coffee in the morning, and then, having my meals at around the same time, and then getting to bed at the same time. I think that is pretty important for your overall health. But in terms of like there being sort of a time that you want to stop eating, I don't necessarily think that's the case. I mean, I don't want to say for sure, because it's not something I've looked into a ton. But I think what's more important is that you just want to make sure that your food is digesting well at your last meal, because if you have digestive disturbances throughout the night, that's absolutely gonna interrupt your sleep and cause you to wake up and things like that. So I think generally, like I think it's like in like Spain or some of these European countries, it's very common for families to eat dinner like at like 9 or 10 or whatever. And I think that's, it's fine if you want to do that.
So going to bed with your stomach full of food is not going to affect your sleep quality? I thought it does.
Well, that's kind of where I was going with this, is that, I think what's more important is that you just, if you can get like a good walk in and just make sure it's all kind of digested before you get to bed. But I'm not a huge fan of like saying like, oh, no food after 7 p.m. Like that's
Yeah.
I don't know how useful that is. Or and again, a lot of people don't feel like they can do that, and then that interrupts their sleep if they don't have food closer to bed, because that is the period where you're going the longest without food, obviously, is when you sleep. So to add on top of that and to try to like almost fast before bed, I don't know if you're putting yourself in a position to succeed, really. I think the goal would be to minimize the stress at night by, making sure that you do have plenty of food, but while also minimizing the digestive stress. So yeah, I mean, if you're going to have like a huge meal at dinner, then you don't want to just walk into bed like right immediately after. But I also don't think that saying, you can't eat anything after a certain hour. I don't think that is extremely helpful either. So yeah, I mean, from that perspective, I think it would probably be better for, that's kind of why I normally eat more at lunch. But yeah, I think if you're going to have a light-ish dinner and then just make sure you have plenty of sugar to make it through the night, and then you should be good to go, because that should all be pretty easily digested, unless there's those problems.
Ray talks about shellfish, and you mentioned shellfish. From the working class perspective, do you think farm raised shrimp are healthy to eat, and farm raised scallops, stuff like that?
I think
because a working class family isn't going to be able to afford wild caught shrimp typically, unless they're in a certain country where it's cheap, or a region where it's very cheap.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I think it's better than not having it at all, probably. But yeah. So I think it's actually a little bit different for the shellfish. The farmed like bigger fish tend to be more unhealthy, but a lot of times the farmed smaller fish are actually more healthy than even the wild caught varieties. I know that's at least true when it comes to oysters. But yeah, so things like canned oysters, do not have to be super expensive. I think that
But
would be
they usually
important.
have seed oils in them, don't they? Like sunflower, sunflower.
They certainly can, yeah.
Yeah,
So ideally you just get it in water, or if you know that it's like actual olive oil, you can do that too.
yeah.
But yeah.
What do you supplement with hormones like pregnenolone?
Yeah, I use pregnenolone. I've tried progesterone before. I've never really like experienced any benefit, and honestly, I think it's probably better for women. Pregnenolone is something that I've talked about a ton. I'm a huge fan of it.
And you take that in the
Just
morning or with coffee or what?
So typically that is, that's kind of all supplements, that I take, and I'm probably sounding like a broken record here, but pretty much everything I try to do just off of feel, like how I'm feeling. So
Yeah.
whether that's food or supplements. So the pregnenolone, I know what the effect of that is, and it's just very like calming. It's very grounding. It's very like anxiolytic. So and it
What's
kind
that
of
word
like
you use?
clears your head.
Anxiolytic. What does that mean?
Oh, like anti-anxiety.
Okay.
So yeah, those would be the main properties of pregnenolone. And then, if I
And you just
feel
take that with the empty stomach randomly once in a while or every day?
yeah, it's pretty sporadic based on how I'm feeling. But it's one of these things that it kind of is most potent when you first start taking it, because it's one of these things that helps improve your body's overall stress and metabolism, so that you can actually start producing more pregnenolone in the future. So I think, if someone were to start, and then I would probably recommend taking it pretty regularly, maybe like once or twice a day. My go-to way of doing it is sublingual, so that completely bypasses any intestinal absorption, because it's not very well absorbed in the intestines. But I've found in myself and working with other people that the sublingual route, kind of dramatically improves that, because you're bypassing that system. Um,
How much amount of pregnenolone do you take usually a day if you take it?
so I typically will do around 150 as a single dose sublingually. If things are very stressful, I can
Milligram,
I
is that
can
milligrams?
Oh yeah, sorry if I didn't say that.
Is that based on, do you determine that based on weight or just like what? Like I mean, I know this is just your own personal thing, so you're not making any claims. I'm just saying for yourself, do you base that on like that amount based on what?
The dose.
Yeah. Is that based on size or weight of the person taking it, or is it like how you feel? Like I tried this 50 milligrams and it didn't make me feel better, and I took 100 and I felt better.
I don't think that pregnenolone, at least in all the studies that I've seen, it's normally not dosed based on weight. Um,
Mm-hmm.
it's typically just given, in the same doses regardless. So, I guess in theory that might make sense. But as far as I know, I don't think that is a primary concern when you're dosing the pregnenolone. I think that, the dose of the pregnenolone, it's more important to consider sort of like the high, the medium, and the low end. So if you're taking like a very low dose, that tends to be converted more readily into the androgens. And then if you're taking higher doses, that tends to be converted more into progesterone, and then into another metabolite called allopregnenolone, which I've talked about a bunch. But that is very potent, calming, sort of GABAergic effects. So it really depends like what you're going for.
So what's low dose? Is 100 milligrams high dose or low dose typically for
I
pregnenolone?
would I would say that's definitely on the higher end. If you're trying to do if you're trying to get more androgens out of it, you'd probably be looking at like under 20 milligrams, maybe 10 or even less. Um, but I also don't think that is really the at least the way that I use it. I don't think that that's like a primary goal of using pregnenolone is to really raise the androgens. I think of it more as this primary like potent anti-stress sort of compound, and something that you can use to restore your body's capability to produce it, and then that builds resilience to stress in the future. It also has a lot of like anti-fatigue effects. So yeah.
Does it help with your sleep?
Yeah, it can. Some people say that if they take it, then they get more like stimulated. And that's because there's a metabolite of pregnenolone called pregnenolone sulfate, and that tends to be a little bit more stimulating. However, I think in most people it tends to be much more calming. And the sourcing also matters a ton, which is why we really support the Health Natura brand, because it's, uh, we have all of the lab work done, and we know it's like certified and very high purity, and I'm constantly in contact with them about that. But a lot of the pregnenolone products out there are of very questionable quality, or are not certified, or might have something like pregnenolone acetate, which you don't want because it's not the same thing. So I think that people can run into issues if they're taking you know supplements of questionable quality, but for the most part it tends to be very calming at the higher doses.
A lot of Ray Peat fans take a thyroid supplement. Do you take a thyroid supplement?
I have in the past. It's just one of these things that I don't think I think that there are other more low-hanging fruits to go for than just immediately going for the thyroid supplementation. And I think that because Ray talked about thyroid so much, that is what immediately people want to sort of hop on. But I think that the way that Ray would talk about thyroid is more the whole sort of thyroid axis. And that's not necessarily just taking thyroid. A lot of people, including myself, but a lot of people that I've worked with and that I see, they have sort of, what is commonly called like functional hypothyroidism, which is basically like you have plenty of the hormone in your blood. So supplementing it further is not necessarily, what is going to move the needle for you. But other things like just generally lowering stress or improving liver function, uh, those are really important. And then also estrogen is a key sort of binder. And then you also have, of course, the polyunsaturated fats, which tend to sort of block the actions of the thyroid. And then things like taking B vitamins can be very critical. And then just in general, there are a lot of other players in the metabolic process other than just the thyroid hormone. And a lot of times people don't get their desired result, or they get it can be kind of hard to dose because it can be very powerful in some people. But in a lot of cases, I find that focusing on gut stuff first, because that can be, we haven't even talked about serotonin, but that can be such a huge break on the metabolism systemically. And then really dialing in nutrition, trying things like B vitamins, fat soluble vitamins, trying to improve the liver function, reducing the estrogen, reducing the stress with things like pregnenolone. I think that is a much better start. And then you'll find that your thyroid hormone utilization, like just based on what your body already produces, is much improved. Now I will say that it was very common historically for people to consume thyroid gland with active thyroid hormones in them. And then of course, you had the pharmaceutical companies in the 70s who patented a unique version of thyroid hormone, and then non-coincidentally gets taken out of the food supply a couple of years later. But it's just it's just another one of these things that we've been talking about.
You
But
said focus on the gut and
yeah.
serotonin. What would be just a little quick snapshot focus that people need to look into more about gut health?
So I think generally you really want to look at symptoms. So if there's any nausea, if there's any sort of indigestion, any acid reflux, constipation, diarrhea, bloating, gas, etc., those are the big things to look out for. And one of the best ways that I've seen to sort of diagnosis is to look at your tongue. So that is kind of like a gateway into the gut, because it's actually just one large interconnected system, your mouth all the way down to your anus. But if people have chronic like bad breath, or they have like a coated or white tongue, or they have dental problems, that can be a very good indicator that something is sort of festering in the gut that you want to address very soon. So yeah, those those would be the big things that I would look out for in terms of symptoms. And then in terms of how to address it, you know, not everyone is going to need pharmaceutical antibiotics like I did. A lot of people do seem to really benefit from them. But yeah, I think generally, I think the main value in sort of limiting or avoiding starch is because if it's not prepared in a very specific way, it can be highly fermentable. And that is something that you really want to avoid, at least from the bioenergetic perspective. So yeah, avoiding any type of fermentable carbohydrates. So that can include starches. It can include certain types of fibers. And there's also a bunch of indigestible material and other sort of just excipients that are in our food, different gums, different dyes, different emulsifiers. The list goes on and on about the different, sort of just garbage that is in the food supply. If you're not looking, all these things can really irritate the gut. And then when you make an effort to clean up the sourcing of your food and the diet in general, a lot of people can see big improvements there. But the most common thing that I see is people just dealing with bacterial problems. So in that case, like I said, not everyone needs the pharmaceutical antibiotics. That can be a very good option. I'm a big fan of mastic gum, which is a very potent anti-inflammatory, antibacterial thing for the gut. I'm also a big fan of vitamins D and K2, D3 and K2. Those are sort of just like endogenous antibacterials as well. And then in general, keeping the bowel movements very regular and well formed and whatnot. It's kind of the ultimate barometer of this stuff, because that is your body's way of actually eliminating all of that stuff. And if you're not doing that consistently, then you're going to run into a world of problems. But obviously in the gut, because you're essentially, if you're not moving it out, it can't really go anywhere else but stay inside of you. And then it becomes this chronic issue that so many people deal with. Even if people don't have like overt gut problems, so many people either have the coated tongue or they're, subclinically constipated basically, or any number of these issues, or they have a poor appetite. These issues are so common, which is why I typically start there, because, I very rarely have someone come to me and is like, yeah, like my digestion is great. I'm having like 1 to 2, like perfectly formed bowel movements every day. My appetite's strong. I have zero bloating, but I feel like crap. That's just not really something that you see. Typically, a lot of this stuff does start in the gut. And a lot of that is driven by serotonin. So,
do you eat the Ray Peat carrot salad to address gut issues?
I should have mentioned that. I'm actually, I don't know if anyone has talked to you about the mushrooms. But that is something that I'm a huge fan of. I'm actually not a big fan of the carrot salad. I guess that maybe makes me like a fake Ray Peat guy, but I was never I don't know. I just never like really tolerated super well, just from the sense that I don't know. I always found that my gut health was better without it. And then the other thing is that if you eat it at night, it can have pretty bad effect on your sleep, because it kind of acts as like a irritant, which is why it helps propel bowel movements. But yeah, it's just not something that I'm personally a huge fan of. That's not to say that a ton of people don't benefit from it, but I think you have to look at the individual, like, sort of risk versus reward profile there, because it is, an indigestible fiber. That is kind of the whole point. So if someone is, has a more sensitive colon or digestion in general, things that don't get digested and make it to the colon and basically are just there to irritate it and or ferment, that is where you really run into a lot of these problems. So yeah, for me, I'm not a huge fan of it.
So you like mushrooms? I remember Ray Peat used to tell me have well cooked mushrooms.
Absolutely.
And do you just like boil mushrooms and then eat them, or like what do you do with that?
Yeah. So basically, there's a number of studies on the white button mushrooms, which are just like the most common ones that you can find at the grocery store.
Yeah.
But yeah, in a lot of these studies where they're finding anti-cancer, antibacterial, anti-inflammatory effects of these mushrooms, what they're doing is they're making an extract from the mushroom, and that is done by boiling the mushroom for anywhere from 1 to 3 hours. So that's where Ray originally got the idea to boil them for such a
Yeah.
ridiculous amount of time.
I
But
remember he used to say, it was like basically boil the hell out of them. Yeah.
yeah. So that's
And then you
what I
drink
do.
the serum. You drink the serum that it produces.
No, I don't know. I just take them after I strain them, and then I can, I'll typically boil like 4 pounds of them in at one time, because you don't want to be doing that every day, obviously. So
Yeah.
if you can have them, you can just put them in the freezer in there, and they're pretty much good to go for quite a while.
And what do they do?
Yeah.
What's the special thing about the mushroom?
So they're directly antibacterial. They have anti-estrogenic effects, and anti-inflammatory for the gut specifically. And yeah, in myself and in other people, it definitely has like a pro-motility effect as well on the gut. And I think you had mentioned earlier, but yeah, that's a huge part of this whole equation. And it kind of becomes like a positive feedback loop, because you need good energy production systemically for having proper gut motility, but you also need the proper gut motility, and you need the gut to be clean for good energy production in general. So I find that in most cases, starting with the gut and also trying to address the energy, knowing that there's they're always playing off of each other, that is a very important sort of place to start when you're trying to figure these things out. It just happens to be the case that seems to be one of the most common hindrances to the metabolism that I see.
What about people that are, wondering what's so special about orange juice? What do you like about orange juice?
I think I think it's not even necessarily that orange juice is like incredibly special. Maybe that didn't sound right. Maybe the other Ray Peat people will get mad at me for saying that, but I think orange juice is awesome. But I think the real thing is that the other types of fruit juices are flawed in their own unique ways. So grape juice, for example, I love grape juice, but you can't really tolerate a ton of it because it contains a lot of something called glycerol, and that acts as an osmotic laxative. So it basically really irritates your digestive tract by affecting the water balance in your colon.
Mm-hmm.
So that's obviously not something that you want to deal with. And then other fruit juices have different sort of issues related to them. Obviously it's not like orange juice is the only fruit juice that you can have, but it just happens to be the case that it is globally the least offensive of the fruit juices. And it's awesome because obviously everyone knows it has a lot of vitamin C, but if you get fresh orange juice, and I know you said you're in Florida, so hopefully you're taking advantage of that. But if you're getting fresh squeezed orange juice, it comes with actually a lot of minerals and B vitamins in there as well, especially the potassium and the magnesium. It's overall just a very hydrating. It's just like a perfect sort of drink to have around because it's, like I said, it's very hydrating. It's got the sugar that you need. It's all very digestible. It tastes really good. It has the sugar. Yeah. So it's pretty awesome from that perspective.
Ray Peat often mentions keeping your calcium to phosphorus ratio right, so you're getting more calcium to phosphorus. Is that something you keep track of, and what would those foods be to stick with? I know he recommends like low fat cheeses like Parmesan, and I guess milk is more calcium to phosphorus. I think orange juice is the opposite, right? More phosphorus to calcium. I don't know.
Yeah. So to be honest, there are very few foods that have a positive like calcium to phosphate ratio. Milk is one of the only ones, and it's just barely scrapes by. So even and milk and cheese really. So even something like cottage cheese or Greek yogurt that I consume a lot of, those actually have more phosphorus than calcium, even though they're
Right.
better sources of calcium than pretty much anything else. So yeah, I think from that perspective, I like to add just some calcium carbonate in my milk, and I drink a good amount of milk for sure. But if I didn't add in the additional calcium, I wouldn't be at like a positive balance per se. And
See, from a fundamental standpoint, it makes people skeptical because they're like, if so few foods have the right calcium to phosphorus ratio, and yet Ray Peat's preaching have an abundant diet. I mean, it's kind of like a contradiction from the intuitive feeling, right? Like, eat 5,000 calories, but so few foods. I mean, it's like, who wants to eat the few foods only to get 5,000 calories of, you know what I mean? So this is where we get into the diet, where diet becomes an ideology. But if it's important, then people maybe need to try to do that. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, well,
but
I actually agree with that a lot. I think a better takeaway message is to try to get more calcium in your diet, period. Because if you look at most of even in so-called healthy diets that you see, whether it's like a vegan or a calorie restricted typical like bodybuilder diet, if you're just eating chicken and rice, or you're just eating ribeyes, or if you're a vegetarian, and you're eating, kind of lots of salads and plant foods, like most of these diets, and then obviously like a standard American diet, all of these diets are severely lacking in calcium. So I think it is a good take home message for people to eat more calcium. The ratio in and of itself, I do think people can take a little bit too much as gospel, especially when you consider that there are other factors at play there, because the whole point behind the calcium to phosphate ratio being high is because it suppresses something called parathyroid hormone, and parathyroid hormone being this sort of pro-inflammatory, metabolic slowing hormone that tends to leach calcium from your bones. One thing that's incredibly important to lowering parathyroid hormone in general is vitamin D. And one of the important actions of vitamin D systemically is to promote the absorption of calcium in the intestines. And then you also have the fact that, eating more sugar in general actually does promote more nutrient absorption. And then you also have the intracellular balance of calcium to phosphate. Calcium is really not something that should be in your soft tissues, obviously. It's something that is meant to be like in your bones and your nails and whatnot, and your teeth. But it's very important for it to be circulating and not in your cells locked up, where the stress hormones can come in and sort of leach it out of your bones to get more of it. So yeah, driving calcium into the cell is actually one of the primary stress reactions of the cells. So like one of the most popular, I think it's like blood pressure lowering classes of drugs are calcium channel blockers. And that's because high blood pressure is a stress driven disease. And the taking in the calcium into those cells is what drives a lot of this high blood pressure, which is, a stress reaction. So, it's not just as simple, in my view, at least, as you just need to eat this certain balance of calcium to phosphate. I think calcium handling in the body is a whole topic in and of itself. And yeah, I do think that you want to keep your parathyroid hormone low, but I don't think that means that you need to be eating a 90% milk diet, or whatever the case may be, to achieve that.
It's interesting that some of those monks in the Christian tradition eat cheeses only and stuff like that, so they probably getting a good calcium to phosphorus ratio, right?
Yeah, might be some of the might be some of the only people that do, other than the Peat people. But
yeah, I want to land the plane here, but I do want to ask just quickly, just real brief answers for this, as best as possible, for folks who live in the city. They've got EMF Wi-Fi boxes all over their neighborhood. They've got cell phone towers every 5 feet. I mean, it's insane. And then for folks in the country, I'm good to go. But then they see people spraying, pesticides and stuff all over near their farmland. So, first of all, is there any Ray Peat principles for healing or protecting your body, your thyroid, your energy, your health, your longevity in both of those situations?
With pesticides and EMF.
Yeah, it's like you feel like you can't escape it. You go to the country, they're spraying pesticides in the field next to yours. You go to the city, they got pesticides and stuff, but they also got EMF radiations and cell phone towers and Wi-Fi boxes everywhere in apartments and so forth. So, how do you protect yourself from those things and longevity?
Yeah. I think there's always going to be specific interventions that you can use for any given environmental stressor, whether it's mold or it's heavy metals or it's pesticides or it's endocrine disruptors. There can be different specific interventions that you can use in those cases. But I think generally the whole philosophy behind bioenergetics is to have your systems operating at a level that you're able to be resilient to those stresses, and then that your detoxification system is functioning optimally, because it really does all come down to energy, just at large, in any system that exists in the universe, not even just life, but in order to sort of maintain the integrity of any given system, it needs energy. It needs energy to do that. And that's especially true biologically, because once you start to get into the thick of things, you realize that no matter what system in the body you're talking about, whether it's, I have cavities, or I have brain fog, or I have liver disease, or I've whatever vision problems, any of these problems is really just a manifestation of an impaired metabolism to an extent, because all of those systems really need the proper energy production in order to maintain their structure and their integrity. So yeah, I mean, I know it's kind of like a politician answer, but it's really about the whole trying to do as many things as possible to put yourself in the position to have a higher metabolic rate. So it's really all the things that we've been talking about, and trying to listen to your body and not ignore signs and symptoms, or not ignore cravings, or anything like that, because we're dealing with a lot of foreign sort of stressors that are being imposed on the body, at any given moment nowadays. But it's humans do run the planet for a reason, or we're incredibly resilient when you put us in the right situation.
Now, I got to know Ray Peat a little bit there near the end of his life, but for some of critics who would say, well, he died at 87, and again, I'm not speaking ill of him, but and there's always a bunch of factors where they say, if he's doing this anti-aging thing, why didn't he live to be 110 or something like that? I mean, what would you say? I know it's kind of a cheap shot that some critics might say, but also, when you have to play devil's advocate, I mean, and if you're advocating for some kind of what seems for most people in America to be kind of a counterintuitive way of looking at it, when it's not, it's what people used to eat for the most part. In America, but the burden of proof is going to be on the contrarian voice. Well, Mr. Contrarian, heal thyself. Why didn't you live to be 110? And again, for fans of him, it might seem like a cheap shot, but what would you say to that line of thought?
Yeah. Well, first off, I don't think that dying at 87 is it's not like he died at 67,
Yeah.
So,
but some people have grandmas that eat fried chicken covered in seed oils, and they live to 100 and they're doing fine, right? But that's the typical American response to, don't tell me to get rid of my seed oils and my grains. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
My corn or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, Ray's story is very interesting, because a lot of times, and this is what made him so special, is that he figured out a lot of this stuff because he was so ill for a lot of his life that he had to think outside the box and try different things, and sort of really dig into things on his own because he wasn't really getting any help otherwise, and his health was deteriorating pretty quickly. So I don't
Wow.
think, as far as I know, he didn't really start applying a lot of his principles until like his mid 40s around. So, it's hard to overcome like a very questionable developing, not only just like literally in the womb, but like as you're growing up and as you're maturing. If you're not put in a great position there, it can be very hard to overcome it. And I think obviously it's possible and plenty of people do it. But it's always an uphill battle from that perspective. And yeah, so I think he had been dealing with a lot of health problems for many years, and then he really had his most vital sort of years uh in his 40s and 50s, and so on. He released Generative Energy, which is like his most famous book. I think that came out in 1994, and he was born in 1937, I think 1936. So that was like when he really, like, he wasn't even peating until then. So
Yeah.
it's very interesting. And then he has pictures of himself in his books where he has like old pictures, and then he has pictures once he started doing things like taking pregnenolone. And just generally, you'd be hard pressed to find someone who in their older age was, writing and talking about all these different sort of topics that Ray was. And did he live to 105 or whatever? No, he didn't. But I think, his second half of his life was so extraordinary, just in what he was able to, sort of piece together, all of the writing that he did, all of the all of what he did to give back to the communities. I think it's admirable, and it's something that people should at least look at, if it matters to them at all. Um, yeah.
Well, Dalton, I really appreciate your time. Where can people continue to follow your work and stay in touch with what you're doing?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're on YouTube. Analyze and Optimize is the name of our channel. And then we're on Twitter. We're at Outdoctrination. So like indoctrination, but with an out. And then we're on Instagram at Analyze and Optimize. Those would be the big ones. And then, we have tons of supplements. I do consultations. Like I said, we're launching a new consultation service with other healthcare practitioners on board as well. So that'll be pretty awesome very soon. And yeah, we're just getting started. There's the cool thing about bioenergetics is that because it's very principle based, and it doesn't really box you in. There's a lot of places to go. So we have a ton of ideas. And yeah, I'm just it's been a great sort of period of growth for the community and for ourselves. So I can't wait to just see things continue to blossom, and hopefully we can make some change out there.
We appreciate your time, sir. And again, for folks who want to stay in touch with what we're doing here at A Neighbor's Choice, you can email us hello@aneighborschoice.com. I'm David Gornoski. Godspeed.